Hazel, thank you so much for joining me today. How are you doing?
I'm good, Rosanna. Lovely to see you after all this time.
Really lovely to see you. Yeah, for those that don't know, which I imagine most people won't, we did connect on a cruise, which is my favourite type of holiday. And we got into a very deep discussion over breakfast, which after you left, actually, you'll probably quite like this. The people at our table turned around to me and they were like, you were having a very deep chat over breakfast, weren't you? About the meaning of life and all these different things. And I said, yeah, this is kind of, part and parcel of my daily routine, really, being a philosophy teacher. So I was happy to do it. So we connected and you told me this really, really moving story about something that you've gone through in your life. And I thought you'd be the perfect person to come on today and talk about this question of how can we cope with life's toughest challenges. So if it's all right, Hazel, I'm going to get you to start off by just giving us a little bit of context as to what you went through, and then we'll go from there.
Sure, thanks. Well, back in 2017, I was happily married to a guy called Alan. We had a great life. We had no children between us. We'd been married before and met late in life. We were having a wonderful life, both working hard and having lots of lovely holidays. And he complained of having a bad arm on holiday. And I just said, well, when we get home, perhaps you should see the doctor, which he did. And then the doctor sent him for tests and usual thing. A couple of months later, we're sitting in the office of the consultant, and he said to my husband, I'm terribly sorry to tell you, you've got 6 months to 2 years to live, which was a horrendous surprise to both of us, because when you've got just a weak arm, you assume it's a muscle or a ligament or a bit of arthritis, or you've maybe had a mini stroke, but you don't expect to be told that you've got a terminal condition. And what he'd actually got was motor neurone disease. And we were told at the time that he would become 100% paralyzed and that he may end up on a breathing machine. He may end up losing his voice, may end up losing the ability to swallow. And people who've been watching the news will know about this disease because there've been some rugby players on television about it. Well, that's exactly the same thing that my husband had. So at the time I met you, I'd been widowed probably nearly 5 years. And in that 5 years, COVID had happened. And I used COVID as an opportunity to write up all the notes I'd made while Alan was ill and all the things that had come into my mind while he was ill. I just used to write everything down every night. And I converted it all into a book in COVID, which I launched in June 2023.
That's a lovely bit of context there. And for those wondering, I've got a copy of the book here. It's called Life's Good. It's the disease that's the problem, which I think that's something that Alan said, wasn't it?
Yes, it was his favourite phrase. He used to use it a lot with a swear word in the middle. And I didn't have the courage to put the swear word in the title of the book.
Fair enough.
But I can do it for you now. He used to say, life's good. It's the bleep, bleep, bleep disease that's the problem. And I was thinking about the title of the book. I nearly called it Comfortably Numb, which was a Pink Floyd song that he loved. And we played it at a funeral. And I nearly called it that because with MND, of course, when you're 100% paralyzed, you do feel a sort of numbness all over you. But then it just occurred to me, life's good. It's the disease, it's the problem was a much more positive sounding title.
Yes. Definitely. And I can understand that, because something that I noticed about the book as I was reading it is it's a really moving account of what you personally were going through and also what Alan was going through as well. It gives you that kind of day-to-day account of what was happening because it is in that diary form. But at the same time, it's very practical. So it included a lot of links to websites that people could visit or organizations that people could use if they were going through something similar. And I really like that mixture, that kind of emotional, but that practical outlook as well. So I'd love to talk a little bit about what inspired you to write this book. You're going through something so difficult, you and your husband, and the book kind of paints it as a very kind of strong love story as well. You know, you had this wonderful relationship. You go through something, so difficult, so all-consuming, I would imagine, at times as well. What inspired you to take something so difficult and turn it into something that you think could help people?
It wasn't my idea.
Okay.
I'll own up to that. What happened was I was posting on Facebook, and people who knew us well were picking up news of what was happening through Facebook, because it isn't very practical to tell all your friends and family what's going on other than using social media. And it was our occupational therapist who looked after Alan who said, I think if you could write a book about what you're going through, I think it would help not just other members of the public who may be going through any kind of terminal condition, not just MND, but cancer. She recognised that the way we were approaching Alan's end of life was very inspirational. And so she said, I think it'd be great if you could write such a book. And not only that, it would help the professional people who only come into your life for like an hour every couple of days or once every couple of weeks. And most health professionals only see their patients for small snippets of time. They never see the whole picture of what it's like caring for somebody in the home who is dying. They never see all the struggles and ups and downs and all the laughter and all the tears. They never see all that. So she encouraged me. And then when I started to talk to other friends, they said, well, yeah, you know, the way you write on Facebook is really lovely. Perhaps you should write a book. So that was it. I got my idea. But then I thought, I can't just do this. I need to refer this. So I said to Alan one day, and he was calmly sitting in his hospital bed, I think at the time, I said, it's been put to me that I should maybe write a book. What do you think? And he was 100% for it. Without hesitation, he said, yes, I want you to do it. I want people to know what this is like, not just for me, but for you as well. He said, I want people to see what carers, what caregivers go through. I thought that was really unselfish of him. He wanted other people to learn what it's like from the caregiver's perspective as much as from the person with the disease.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that mixture makes the book so powerful because it gives your account of what it was like for you, but also what it was like for him. And I think we could define this really as one of, if not life's toughest challenge, right? Because from this perspective, you've got this amazing relationship, you're happily married, and then you get this kind of bombshell news that Alan's only got a certain amount of time to live. And that would be so difficult, I think, for somebody to go through. So you talked about the shock that you felt at the time. I'm wondering as well, because you were writing every day, a lot of people talk about that as quite a cathartic process, that it helps them to kind of deal with their emotions. Was that something that you felt at the time, or do you feel like that helped looking back?
Well, before Alan was ill, I was not a journaler. And I think I just did it originally for practical reasons. Originally, it was because we were having so many different meetings. And I ended up with two books. One was a blue one, which was the one I wrote all the medical stuff in it. And the other one became the personal stuff, my own thoughts, fears, what Alan had said to me in the day. And it just became a habit that I developed quite early on. And then as I was going along, the weirdest things started to happen. Poems would pop into my head from absolutely nowhere, random stuff, but they were definitely poems. They weren't just thoughts. I started to scribble them down. And when I came to write the book, I wanted to put everything in it. Would you believe, Rosanna, when I first wrote this thing, it was 170,000 words long.
Oh, wow.
And that's because I put absolutely every minutiae of detail in it, plus all the lovely comments I had from friends and family about Alan. I wanted it to be all about Alan.
Yeah.
But that really wasn't practical. And then somebody said, well, maybe you should split it and do two books. But in the end, what I did was I had about 8 different people look at it, and with their help, we managed to refine it down to what it is now, which is 350 pages of the journey we went on from pre-diagnosis through diagnosis, through the disease, and what's happened since Alan's passed away. Because I didn't want to leave the book on a sad note, i.e. his death. I wanted it to have an uptick at the end, if you like. Although it's been sad losing him. It's 5 years now. There has been some positivity come out of the whole experience.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear you say that, because it's something I think people talk about often in the abstract. And this is why it's so impactful to hear personal stories that people have gone through, because we can say, oh, the tough things that we go through in life can make us stronger. But when you're actually in the thick of it, I imagine it might not have felt like that at the time. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, I mean, at the time, you're firefighting, you're leading every day, every hour, every minute at a time. Certainly in those early days, we were both in a very bad state. Both of us emotionally were in a bad state.
Yeah.
As you rightly say, we were a deliriously happy couple. We were almost a nightmare for our friends because we were so happy. But I think people reveled in our happiness. People were pleased to see me happy, my family in particular. I'd had, not the best of lives up until I met Alan. And then suddenly everything was golden and wonderful. But there were some definite dark days that we had to dig deep. There were days where Alan's mood would drop or my mood would drop. And I tried to protect him from
Yeah.
seeing all of my moods, which is why I think I was writing it at the end of the day. It was easier sometimes to write it all down. Having sort of hidden it from Alan during the course of the day, I was scribbling it down at night instead. I wasn't really dealing with it. I was just coping, I think.
Yeah, dealing with something, coping. I think they are two different things. One thing that I noticed that was kind of a little bit of a recurring theme in the book was this idea of not indulging in too much self-pity. And I thought that was really impressive, not having this go as me, why has this happened to me kind of thing. But then there were times you were maybe a little bit more relaxed with that rule and didn't impose it too harshly. So I'd love to hear a little bit more about where that strength, if you like, came from. This idea of I'm not going to wallow, I'm not going to feel too sorry for myself, but then also allowing yourself to sometimes have times when you do just feel like everything's a bit terrible, and let's just feel it so that we can acknowledge it.
Yes, absolutely. I think what happened was there were times where Alan's strength called me to account, and there were times where my strength called him to account. We were pretty evenly balanced in our temperaments, and quite early on we realized there were certain questions for which there were no answers, such as, why did I get this? How did this happen? Why me? And we realized that if we kept asking those questions for which there was no answer, we were going to damage our mental health. We kind of instinctively knew those were bad questions to be asking ourselves all the time. So we decided, let's not ask those anymore. That's not going to help us. Neither of us had fiery tempers, and neither of us had indulged in self-pity or anger up to the point of this disease occurring. And I think we didn't want to let anger or any of the other negative emotions spoil the beauty of what we already had. I suppose in a way, we didn't want this disease to spoil us as people. We wanted to stay as we were as people dealing with a disease situation. Alan took a lot of strength from watching Doddy Weir on television. He was an amazingly strong individual. I think Alan drew strength from that. Alan was a marathon runner. He'd been used to pushing himself physically. He'd cycled long distances. He'd been used to pushing himself mentally as much as physically when the chips were down. So we had that strength of character. But we did, both of us, every so often, we fell off the wagon, so to speak. And then we would indulge ourselves a little bit and have a good old cry. And we had a lot of counselling. I have to say, we did have counselling from a local hospice, and we were lucky enough to have a psychologist involved with us for a bit. And she helped us put some of our thoughts in order. I do think it's a sad thing that people who get terminal diagnoses don't always get access to psychological support. I think there needs to be better psychological support for people with terminal conditions, because it is a hard thing. It's a hard thing to process. I think it took ages for Alan to come to a point of accepting he was going to die. But when he did accept that, it was almost like a change. The point where he wasn't accepting it, when we were trying to get on drug trials and everything else, was different to the period where he'd accepted it and he knew he was going to die, and he could almost like relax into this idea, okay, I'm going to die, so let's make the best of a bad situation. I, on the other hand, the whole time he was alive, was dreading the idea of him dying. I didn't want him to die. I would have chopped off my right arm to save his life. So I was always battling, I think, in my head, even if I wasn't explaining it to him, I was always battling my demons of, one day I'm going to be a young widow, one day I'm going to be without him. None of that felt fair. I probably went into a deeper trough than he did in some respects, but I was always mindful of wanting to stay strong in front of him. But I did reach the stage where I had to reach out in the middle of the night to the Samaritans, just one time. But I did struggle once in particular.
Yeah, and again, I think that's part of being human, really. It would be strange if you didn't, given the situation. And it's almost unimaginable to someone who's not gone through this, because I'm trying to picture what it would be like, but it's so difficult. Mourning the past, so before the diagnosis, you'd count all your firsts with Alan, right? Like, it's the first time we've done this, first time we've done that. Then it got to be counting the last. And that's a huge shift So you're thinking about what the relationship was like before the diagnosis, then you're trying to deal with what's going on in the present, the physical demands and concerns, and trying to change how your house is and everything to make it more accessible. And then you're thinking about your future, of course. So that's so many things to be thinking about all at once, and it can feel overwhelming. So it's not a surprise that, you know, you would have had times where it just felt almost impossible to cope. So what would you say if you had to give some kind of practical advice to somebody who is in that position, where it might not be because of MND, or it might be, could be any kind of challenge that they're going through, when people get to that point where they just feel like, I just want to run away from it all, I can't cope with it, do you have any words of wisdom that you might offer to someone who's in that position?
Well, I do, because since I published the book, I've become a public speaker and I talk about Alan's story. That's one of my talks. Another talk I give is about caregiving, how to avoid burnout. And in both of those talks, I cover the subject of mindset. I cover the subject of self-care. And I think for us, and for me in particular, I know it's a bit of a sort of a corny phrase, but it was about living in the moment. It's about trying to just stay present and be there, if you like, just be in that moment there. It's awfully hard because in the back of your mind, you've got all these other things whirring around. But over time, I learned just to enjoy sitting holding hands with Alan and not worrying about the future, just watching box sets with him. And at the end of the day, if you don't look after yourself as a caregiver, you can't look after the person you love and care for. So it is about being a little bit selfish, if I may put it that way. You have to look after number one, which is you, before you can look after your loved one. And the demons will come into your brain. I heard myself several times in my head, I'm going to be on my own one day, I'm going to lose him, what's life going to be like? And I had to stop that monkey brain going round and round. I had to stop it and just try to be in the moment. I learned a lot from having the support of the psychologist, I have to say. But now, in hindsight, I realized that this whole experience has taught me some life skills that will keep me strong going into the future. Because when the chips are down, you've got two choices, really. You sort of cave in and collapse and become a sniveling wreck and useless to everybody, or you dig deep. And you say it's hard to imagine what it's like. It's hard for me to describe what it was like, because there's a pain that comes into your body, but it's not like the pain of a toothache or a headache or a pain in your foot. It's sort of your whole body becomes sort of a tension. It's a crushing feeling inside your body. It's grief inside you, if you like, because the minute you know your loved one's going to die, I think you automatically start a grieving process. And there is a name for this. It's called anticipatory grief. I discovered that. So, but that grief feels like somebody is sitting on your chest. You know, you kind of feel a pressure, almost like you might explode at any moment, because it's in you. It's very, very powerful pain, emotional pain.
I think you have got it across well. And I think giving it that name, which I was quite struck by that, saying that you came across that phrase for the first time, anticipatory grief, knowing that somebody is going to die. And it's difficult, isn't it? Because I guess every relationship is going to end, whether in a breakup or in a death, but it's not something that we like to confront. And you were essentially forced to. Was it helpful to have people put words to it in that way?
Definitely. And in fact, interestingly, I did an interview recently with one of the hospices that Alan was under, and they are planning to put a whole lot more stuff on their website about anticipatory grief, because they recognize there's not enough information out there about it. And they asked me, would I be prepared to share my thoughts and feelings about it? And I did the other day, just like I'm doing with you now. So the hospices are starting to recognize they can perhaps play a significant role here in helping families cope with the psychological aspect of a terminal condition, not just looking after the person who is dying, but the whole family unit.
Absolutely. Yeah. Getting the psychological welfare front and center as well, because the physical stuff is one thing, but would it be fair to say that the psychological side of it was more challenging for you to deal with than the physical?
Absolutely. I mean, the physical is tough, yes, because when somebody is 100% paralyzed, you know, you've got the physical aspects of trying to wash them and shave them and all that lot, which eventually obviously I had help with. We had carers, as you know, but every single moment of every day the psychological stuff was sort of beavering away in the background, and that was by far the greatest challenge. And interestingly, when I was a young woman, I had a hysterectomy because I wasn't very well, and at that point I hadn't had any children, and I was dreading the whole idea of this surgery, A, because I'd never had surgery, but B, because I was worried how I was going to feel afterwards. And I got over the physical aspects of the surgery in like about 3 months. But it took me probably 5 years psychologically to deal with the whole thing of never being a mom and getting
Yeah.
over that process. So I'd been there before in a strange way. I'd been through a form of loss before, loss of motherhood. And I think losing Alan, whilst it was, 100 times worse, I could see parallels. I could see that what I was going through, the physical demands, you just deal with them day by day. The emotional demands are with you in your mind all hours of all days. And post Alan's passing, they've been with me ever since. I'm 5 years down the line now, and I meet people who've suffered loss of a family member, and they talk about the emotional pain, and I say to them, yeah, I get that, I know what that's like. And that emotional pain, when it comes up, even 5 years down the line, is the same level of intensity as it ever has been. The good news is the frequency that emotional pain pops up is less and less. When it comes, it's as bad as it's ever been. And I try to be realistic now. And I say to people who have lost somebody, pain won't go away, but it'll become less frequent and you'll manage it better over time because your life grows around that pain.
Yeah, I'm really glad to hear you explain it in those terms, because I think oftentimes people might feel an element of pressure with any kind of emotional loss they've experienced to move on, get over it, that kind of thing. Time heals all wounds. We hear all these kind of old sayings, but actually hearing you say the intensity's still there, it's just the frequency that's different, makes it, I think, easier for people in a way, because then they don't feel this pressure to get over it and move on, which I don't even know really what those terms mean. I think we just, as a society, have a difficulty with seeing people go through difficult things and not acknowledging that sometimes you need to be sad. It's just part of the process. I guess there's things like anniversary reactions as well. Like I imagine times like Christmas, birthdays can be especially challenging. Did I hear as well that Alan's birthday is the same day as M&D Awareness Day?
It is. 21st of June is Global MND Awareness Day, and it was kind of freaky when we found that out. Because,
That is a bit freaky.
Of all the things that he could have got, of all the things that could have killed him one way, shape, form or another, MND got him, and that's his birthday. So yeah, that was peculiar. And that's why I kind of published the book in June 2023 on his birthday, because it was MND Global Awareness Day. I had 1,500 copies printed, and there's over 1,000 have already been sold. So there's not terribly many left, but I will convert it then into an ebook so people can buy it on a Kindle or something. And I'm probably going to create an audio book eventually. I'd love for it to be made into a TV drama or something.
I think it would translate really well, to be honest. I'd love to see it as a TV drama. I think that would be fantastic. Broadening the reach of this amazing story. And going back to what you were saying before, it might not have been your idea to turn it into a book, but you are the one that did that. And it is something I think to take pride in and think about all the people that you've helped. I just wondered if what you've gone through, has this changed any opinions that you might have had about meaning of life, religion, spirituality? Did that component ever come into it for you at all?
Neither Alan or I were particularly religious before all this happened. A lot of religious people came into our lives to support us during his illness. And I asked him once how he felt about dying and death. And he said he wasn't afraid of death, but he didn't want to die. And that was an interesting conversation. And now I never used to think about my own mortality. I'm only 67. I never used to think about my own mortality or that of anybody other than the older generation. You automatically think about older people. You know you're going to lose them one day. But nowadays, not in a macabre way, but I'm much more conscious that my life will come to an end one day. And I feel at the moment quite calm about the idea of that, because somewhere in my back of my brain, I think I'm going to see Alan again, but I don't know why. I've got no rational explanation of that. I know I'm not going to see him in this life. And it may be just a bit of wishful thinking on my part, but I feel like I will see him again. It would be almost wrong not to see him again. So it hasn't changed my views. I think all living things die. You see it every year in your garden and around you. All living plants come to the end of their cycle and then they're reborn every spring, except all the evergreens. They seem to keep going. And lots of people I know talk about having had a previous life or thinking we have more than one life. I study Buddhism a little bit. I find it interesting how the Buddhists feel about things. But I think all this has done really is sharpened my focus on making the best of the life I have. Having a legacy has been very important to me because I don't have children. And now I've written this book, and I'm actually in the beginning of being part of a second book, which will come out soon. I realized that these are my legacy, my books and my talks, and the way I can impact people by sharing the experience I've had. Every time I do my talks, I get amazing, incredible feedback from people. And people keep telling me I'm inspirational, and I don't feel inspirational. I'm just sharing what happened because I want more people not to be afraid of death, not to be afraid of dying, because Alan had a very peaceful death. And I read a great book by Dr. Catherine Mannix called With the End in Mind, which really helped me understand the process of what happens when somebody dies, what physically happens. And when I understood what physically was going to happen to Alan, it enabled me to be calmer at the moment that he did die. And I was with him when he died. And I feel better now about the whole idea of my own death when it comes. And I know that I'll have lived a good life and I'll have done as much good as I possibly can. And I think I'll be ready when the time comes. I know that sounds crazy for somebody who's only 67 to say that, but I don't want to reach my deathbed thinking, I wish I'd done this, I wish I'd done that. I suppose what it's done is it's just heightened my awareness and heightened my thought process about the fact that we are all going to die. And I feel so much more accepting of death now I've gone through this experience with Alan.
Yeah, I think that's a really wise position to take, because I do think death is something that we still shy away from as a society. And I think informing yourself of the process, to me, has actually been really reassuring. I read a book called The Art of Dying by Peter Fenwick, and I found that very, very reassuring as well, talking about it as not something that's kind of, as it's portrayed in Hollywood, you know, like a really terrible, scary, awful thing, but actually a lot more peaceful and not quite as terrifying.
That's why I always mention Catherine's book when I do my talks, because I think if everybody read, I'll dig out this book you've just mentioned, if everybody read those kinds of books, we'd realise that television just dramatises the whole thing. And in actual fact, it's a very natural process that we all go through in the end. Our hearts and our organs and our bones and our muscles and things just cannot keep going forever. They are all going to stop. If we don't get run over by a bus, which, you know, I don't know what the numbers are, but most people don't get run over by a bus. They don't have a car accident. Most people die just of old age. People just expire. My own mom has vascular dementia. She's had it for quite some years, but she's going along and she's going along and she's going along. I don't know how many more years she'll live, but there's no sign of her dying tomorrow. You know, she's just expiring gradually. And in Alan's case, and in the case of cancer, awful diseases, cancer, MND, they're all awful, but it just hastens that death process that would have happened naturally anyway.
Yeah, I know what you mean. You don't want to come across like you're sounding a bit morbid, but I think there's something really strong about just accepting it. And if you tie it into the Buddhist philosophy as well, one of the key components of that is the idea that attachment leads to suffering. And if you think about attachment in terms of just wanting things to, you know, be other than they are, right? Like just constantly clinging on to something, of course that's going to lead to suffering, because you're not accepting things for what they are and the reality of the situation.
And Sikhs as well. I've spoken to some Sikh people recently. They're great believers in letting go of someone who has passed away. I'm not terribly good at that at the moment. I'm still in the hanging on to Alan in a strange way. You know, I talk about him all the time when I'm doing my lectures and things. And I don't want to let him go because he is still my love source, if you like. He's my strength still, even though he's not here. But I know that probably part of me is going to have to at some point just let that bit go. But I'm not ready.
That's fine. Again, it's part of being human, isn't it? And it's a process for everybody. And by definition, the word process means it's going to take a while, and everybody's timeline is different. And one thing I was struck by, I think you said it towards the end of the book, was about this idea when somebody dies younger or sooner than expected, the relationship kind of stays as it was and it stays perfect, right? So there's this idea that actually, even though the relationship has quote unquote ended, it hasn't really, because you've still got that connection to that person, even though they might not physically be here. It's helpful, I think, to think about it in those terms, really. But anyway, I could talk about this for a lot longer, but I will let you go. What I'd love to end with, though, is just if there's anything you think that we've missed, if there's anything that you'd like to share in terms of any words of wisdom, that'd be great.
If people are going through a tough time, perhaps they are in the process of losing a loved one, I think the main thing to do is just to be with that person. You don't even have to talk or entertain them. You just have to be with them. And that's hard if you're going through your own emotional trauma at the time. And I found it difficult sometimes just to be with Ellen. And I wish in hindsight I perhaps had spent more time just being, not doing. And I remember the psychologist said to me, Hazel, you're very good at human doing. You're not very good at doing the human being. And it did give me cause for thought. That did. So it's a tough journey if anybody is going through it. But you only go through this emotional trauma because you love someone deeply. And if you love someone that deeply and they love you deeply, then that is a real blessing in life. And I try now to look at this, even though my time with Alan was 13 years in total. It wasn't long enough by far. It was the best 13 years of my life. And I still, to this day, feel the love that I had back then. So if somebody is about to lose somebody, then just know that the love goes on. They call it continuing bonds in hospice circles. So that person physically may leave you, but the love does not.
I really like that. I think that's a lovely note to end on. I hadn't heard that phrase before as well, continuing bonds. But again, I think it speaks to the power of having words to express the things that people might be going through. Where can people get a copy of the book if they would like to?
They can only get it on my website, which is called lifesgoodbook.co.uk. It's not on Amazon, it's not in any shops. And the reason for that is I give 100% of the proceeds away to charity. So it's lifesgoodbook.co.uk by Hazel Carter.
Fantastic. I will put that link in the description so that people can access that. And I'm really excited to hear more about your upcoming book as well. Remind me again of the title.
The new one's called Golden Threads. And it's the wisdom of women's, the tapestry of life or something like that. But it's not yet out.
Okay.
But it will be out there one day. I'm the co-author. The main author is a lady called Susan Williams.
Fantastic. Okay, we'll watch this space. Again, thank you so much, Hazel, for joining. It's been an absolute pleasure to talk through this with you. And I do think that you're inspirational. I know it's something that you say you don't necessarily feel, but I think a lot of people can attest to that. So thank you so much for joining.
Thank you.